Good afternoon, folks. My name is Kayla, and I am the social worker at Orchards Walk Medical Clinic. And for folks who've joined these sessions before, you probably recognize myself as well as the two co-facilitators here today, Haley and Ryan. Hi guys. So just some housekeeping before we dive in. Every month we try to run a health and wellness session, and this month we're kind of focusing on, acknowledging the events kind of taking place surrounding us, the mental health concerns and the trauma that folks may be experiencing locally, provincially, and across Canada right now. And I think it's important more than ever to not only highlight the concerns that folks may be facing, the barriers, the trauma, but as well as the stigma surrounding mental health, and just acknowledging those pieces. And so today's session will be very much about those pieces. And we have Haley and Ryan kind of sharing their thoughts, experiences, perspectives, their findings, in hopes to help those who are also struggling, and both have their own pieces they'd like to share today. Again, folks, this is a session that we run at Orchards Walk Medical Clinic, and we're really grateful to have two of these wonderful folks with us. Not only are they our co-facilitators, but they're one of our own OWC patients, but also community members who too face these life events. So no further ado, we'll record the session today, and I'll be posting it to our website in hopes to share around. So keep informed about that. And we'll just take it away, Haley, and we'll start there. Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Thank you. So as Kayla said, we kind of, there's a lot of stuff going on in our environments right now. I mean, in Kamloops alone, we've had fires, we've had everything with the residential schools. So a lot of people are experiencing trauma, and for some people, this may be kind of a first. So I think this is really important, but we also are seeing an increase in mental health disorders within our communities. And a lot of that may have something to do with COVID as well. So, I mean, it's kind of been one thing after the other for all of us. So a really important topic today. I'm going to actually start, I'm going to pull up and share my screen, and I'm going to show you a little slideshow that I have put together. Bear with me for a second. Mm-hmm. Okay, and we can see that okay over there. Okay, so before we actually begin talking about stigma, what I want to talk about is trauma, because in order to have this conversation, we really need to understand what trauma is. So trauma is more than just the actual event itself. Trauma is actually the experience that occurs from the event. So I'm just going to read you this definition. A traumatic event is an experience of physical sensations and psychological disruptions. The brain assigns meaning to the experience and labels the memory accordingly. This process is unique to every person, which is why an event may be traumatic to one person, but to not another. Over here on the right side of the slide, you can see this little suitcase that has all of these things going in it. Basically, every single one of us throughout our whole life has packed a different suitcase with all of the experiences that we've had. That suitcase essentially is going to basically teach our brains how to react to specific situations. And that may be why for one person, there's something maybe more traumatic than another. So just as an example, recently we had the fires in Juniper. There may be people in Juniper who have experienced fires in a traumatic event before. So this may have really set them off a lot more, or set them back, even reverted them to past traumas. So we have to keep all of that in mind. And it's very much the same as when you can have two twins in a family, and one twin may end up with addiction issues and the other twin may be on the totally opposite path. And it really has to do with how their body has experienced those things. They could have experienced the same environment. It could have still been an abusive household, but it all depends on how your body interprets that. So you can't look at one person and be like, well, that fire didn't affect me at all. You guys are overreacting, because they're just not experiencing it the same as you. So that's just something I wanted to make sure everybody is aware of. So there is no shame in you feeling trauma over something that somebody else does not. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's what we want to say is everybody is going to experience things differently. So that's going to lead us right into kind of that stigma role. But I want to show you this video, and it's by Dr. Gabor Mate. He is one of the most amazing MDs when it comes to mental health, an amazing speaker. He travels the world now sharing all of his experiences. He's actually native to BC. He worked down on the Vancouver East Side for many, many, many years, dealing with addictions and trauma and different psychological disorders. So I just want to share this video quickly with you. And I hope it will help to kind of clarify things, and then we'll move on to stigma.
I think we got to turn it up, Haley.
Sorry, I'll restart it. Can you hear it? No volume, hey? Why do we have no volume?
I think when you share a screen, I think there's an option to share with volume, with sound.
Okay.
Yeah.
Share sound. Got it.
Perfect.
Okay. Now we'll try that again.
It's great. No worries.
Seems to always happen. Okay.
So trauma fundamentally means a disconnection from self. Why do we get disconnected? Because it's too painful to be ourselves. That then becomes a lifelong dynamic. I no longer know how to deal with emotions. It means that in relationships, when I feel a bit hurt, I immediately withdraw, so I don't have to feel those emotions that I don't know what to do with. So there's a disconnect. It also means that when I have gut feelings, I don't follow them. So I create situations of risk for myself. Now, trauma also affects how our brains develop. Certain key brain circuits that have to do with how we react and respond and regulate ourselves, how we handle stress, how we interact with other people, how much empathy and insight that we have, how much compassion we have. These functions of the midfrontal cortex are limited and constricted by trauma because we now know that the brain develops an interaction with the environment. So the brains of traumatized children don't look like the brains of non-traumatized children.
So that is definitely trauma in a nutshell. A lot of trauma does come down to events that happen in childhood, but not all trauma has to. It can be things that happen later in life, but our childhood experiences may very well be kind of what leads us into how we react to that. So just something to keep in mind. That video clip is actually from a movie that Gabor Mate is going to be releasing shortly. He's had a couple of screenings on it for free, which is how I ended up with access to it. But it's called The Wisdom of Trauma. It is fantastic. If you have an opportunity to watch it when it comes out, I highly recommend it.
So trauma fundamentally means a disconnection.
And we want to go to the next slide. Okay, so stigma. We're going to talk today about 3 different types of stigma. We're going to talk about public stigma, we're going to talk about perceived public stigma, and we're going to talk about self-stigma. So public stigma refers to the society's negative beliefs, attitudes, and behavioral consequences about mental health disorders, all of which lead to stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination against people with mental health disorders. Perceived public stigma, on the other hand, refers to our perspective of what the public thinks, so their beliefs about mental illness. Perceived stigma actually may be one of the leading causes of why people with mental illness don't seek help for their mental illness, because they're anticipating what they believe the public is going, how they believe the public is going to react. So ultimately, public stigma is the fear of being undesirable, socially unaccepted, judged, and appearing weak to those within our environments. Gender roles, of course, may also play a part in this, and we will definitely touch base on that further. I know Ryan is going to be our spokesperson when it comes to gender roles. I know I can't speak specifically to how that affects me, because males definitely have it a heck of a lot harder. Females do in certain aspects as well. And then there's self-stigma. So self-stigma affects feelings of self-esteem and self-efficacy. One may feel that they are to blame for their mental illness, which causes feelings of shame and guilt. Perceived public stigma and self-stigma actually go hand in hand. Both cause people to choose secrecy, social withdrawal, instead of seeking help. So the 2 topics, we're not going to touch a whole lot of base on the public stigma, because there's actually evidence that says they've done multiple studies that are proving that the public stigma actually has very minimal effect on people coming forward. The actual areas that stop people from coming forward is the way we perceive public stigma, as well as the stigma that we have from in ourselves. So again, especially this comes true when it's taught gender roles in men, who are typically taught, hey, you can't show weakness. Big boys don't cry, you know, that kind of stuff. You're weak if you show emotion, suck it up, that kind of attitude, right? That stuff that's been passed on through many generations. And I mean, it's only fairly recently that we're realizing that this actually has hindered our society. That's not actually true, but that is the perception of a male gender. So public stigma has actually been found to be less significant, as I said, when it comes to individuals seeking help. So we're not going to touch base on that as much. As for a loose agenda, so we're going to talk about, Ryan and I are going to share our own experiences. Both of us have been through the mental health system. We both suffer from mental illness, and we're still recovering. This isn't something that we're over. We're still going through the process. For myself, I also have a psychology degree, so I work on this side of mental health as well. So we're going to talk about that a little bit and how to talk about how perceived public stigma and self-stigma has impacted our journeys. Again, we're going to share our mental health challenges. And at the end, we're going to talk about how do we overcome that? What are our barriers? And what can we do to help ourselves and others that we know that are facing these challenges? So I'm going to stop my sharing. And we're going to begin. I'm going to share my story a little bit with you. And then Ryan will share his. And then we'll get into the kind of conversation about how has opening up about our stories actually affected us stigma-wise. For myself, I deal with major depressive disorder, as well as social and generalized anxiety disorders. I've been off work for a little over a year now, trying to cope with it. And honestly, getting through the system was an incredibly difficult struggle for me. I mean, I've had panic attacks and I had to get on the medication. It took me nearly a year to find a medication that actually stabilized me enough that I feel like I'm finally able to start healing. It also took me a year just to get supports in place. It took me nearly a year to get into a psychiatrist, which is who you have to see to get a diagnosis. And what you find out when you're dealing with the mental health system is without a diagnosis, there's not much that can be done for you other than handing you medications and saying, go see a counselor. But until you have that diagnosis, it's really hard to get the proper counseling that you need and find out what kind of tools you need to develop in your life, right? So for me, the struggles that I came up with when I was dealing with the mental health system was I was told not only that I was not sick enough initially, because initially when I went through Kamloops mental health to try and get into a psychiatrist, I was not suicidal. I've been very fortunate that through my whole journey, I have not been, but I have had severe bouts of hopelessness. And if I hadn't recognized it and hadn't treated it, I'm sure I would have ended up down that road if, you know, I didn't actually take the steps to advocate for myself. So this is why it's so important to have this conversation, because if I let stigma stop me, I very well maybe might not even be here today. So this is why it's so important to talk about our journeys. And so at first, because I was not suicidal, I was told I was not sick enough. And that, for somebody who is dealing so badly with depression, who's having severe anxiety attacks and hiding in an empty bathtub with the curtains closed in the dark because it's the only place you feel secure, that's pretty scary, because that's basically discouraging and saying you're not going to get the help you need. The other thing that happened is when I was going through getting my long-term disability approved. As I said, I do work in mental health. My work is a very high burnout job. I work with severely vulnerable youth within the community that have, you know, a lot of their own mental health illness disorders, a lot of their own trauma. So I was not able to go back to work because my mental health would then impact their recovery. So I was trying to get approved for this long-term disability. And long story short, I ended up seeing a doctor who told me that now not only was I not sick enough, but I was not old enough. And when I first looked at this, I really thought to myself, wow, that is stigma. That's how I interpreted it at first. Now that I have actually begun experiencing things by sharing my story, I'm now realizing that it wasn't actually stigma, but a lack of education on the point of the MDs, the point of the people who were not psychiatrists. And so that's why we're having these conversations, because we need to rip down those boundaries that we have. So that is kind of my journey. I don't know if there's much else that I should necessarily say about it. I think it's probably a really good time to pass it over to Ryan and let him share with us his experience with the system and his story.
Thanks, Haley.
Thank you so much, Haley, and thank you, Kayla. As always, I'm so excited and happy to be invited to a table like this and to be able to have a conversation like this. As Haley mentioned earlier on when she was going through some of the presentation, I think the focus for me will be talking about my history and the gender side of mental illness and how it can affect men. I was definitely raised, as Haley indicated earlier, in the "are you hurt or are you injured" generation. I also was, I remember hearing my father telling me, "I'll give you something to cry about," when some tears would flow at 4, 5 years old. I played a lot of high-end sports as a young adolescent, and was very, very good playing on rep teams and stuff like that. And again, there was never any room for weakness. I was always able to show emotion as long as it was anger and control of others. That was the emotions you were allowed to show. We called it the game within the game. It was being able to intimidate other people in order for them to make mistakes so that you could win. And that was how we developed. And then as an adult, I ended up managing people for most of my career. Always was able to have great conversations with people. Funny enough, when I was a child, I was really shy, which didn't go over very well when I was playing elite sports. And I remember being about 16 years old, and I realized that was a barrier to me getting to know people, and that was a barrier for me at school. And I remember being in a school in Nanaimo with about 2,100 people, and I didn't know anybody. And I had just moved there from Kamloops, and I just realized that I'd had enough. And so I went way outside of my comfort zone, and I just decided that I was not going to be shy anymore. And so I did all these crazy things to be flamboyant and be a chameleon and sort of adapt to this new way of being. But I was reckless in the way that I was doing those things, and of course I became very easily well known very quickly because I was doing crazy stuff, and was also at that time in Nanaimo when I moved there. It was fairly recognizable that I had a sort of a native looking physical appearance, and all my friends, the school that I went to, there were no native people there. And so there was a lot of stigma around me being native and a lot of jokes that were going on. And I remember having to be a chameleon, and I just had to let it bounce off of me and almost sort of ignore that side of my heritage. And I was definitely raised in white society. So I just pretended I was white and just let those things bounce off me. And of course, as an adult, I started working in some fairly high-end jobs, and I was working for construction companies, and then I ended up working in the mining industry, which I still currently work, doing First Nation liaison work. And at that time, I decided that I would, at that time, I started to learn a whole bunch of different things about my heritage and about the different cultures in the area. But at this time, I was moved back to Kamloops, where I currently reside. And, I'm a Skeetcheston band member just outside of Kamloops. Kamloops and Skeetcheston really are the same band back before colonialism. And they were separated just because there were too many people in the band back in the late 1800s. So they separated the two bands. And so then I started to learn about my different cultures and started to have a bit better understanding of things. but I was in a really high intensity job, working on the proposed Ajax project as a First Nation liaison. I had always had problems with drinking, had always had problems with drugs, but they were internalized. I used to make jokes to my ex-wife that 70% of me was still pretty damn good. And me running at 70%, I could still rule the world. And I remember making jokes about that stuff. And there was honestly some truth to being, I was definitely a functioning addict. And I went through years of fighting the drinking and sometimes the drugging. The drugging wasn't always there, but the more my stress level went up, the more the drugs crept in, the more that I was working 14 to 16-hour days, and the more that I became known in the community as somebody that was working on this proposed mining project, the more that I never felt like I had time off. Even when I would go out for dinner, I've got one side of my family that's lived in the area for 10,000 years on the native side. I have a third generation English family on the other side that settled in Kamloops. So I know, or I'm an acquaintance to a lot of people in town. And of course, people feel comfortable coming to talk to an acquaintance over somebody they don't know when they're talking about a project that's quite contentious, which this one was. And so I went through 7 years of just never feeling like I had time off. And so I began taking time off on purpose. So Friday night, I would go out and I would have a bunch of drinks, and somebody would set me off in a conversation about the mine, and it would get stressful. And I would go on a 2-day drug bender over the weekend. And then, the odd time I would call in sick on the Monday because I was just burnt out. And that became a norm of something that would happen every 4 to 6 weeks. And then, we got a new government in, and the project was rejected by the provincial government. And it was also rejected by the different First Nations in the area. The First Nation rejection didn't hurt me nearly as much because I totally understood their process, and I had a lot of respect for the process that my bands and some other bands in the area went through. I thought it was game changing, and I was really happy to be a part of that. The new government coming in that rejected it provincially hurt a lot because they didn't look at the work that we had done. And so there was this feeling of a wasted amount of time. And I'd put my heart and soul into something that was rejected, and it seemed meritless to me at the time. And then I had some internal issues within my family, and within my family, I was considered the rock, and so I didn't feel that I could show weakness within my family, which of course led me to just continue on this road of trying my best to put my best face forward. But there were these cracks that were happening within the so-called rock that I thought I was. And I was starting to succumb more and more to the drinking and the drugging. And again, I wish I could go back and talk to myself about, there were so many moments when I really could have come forward and asked for help. But I really didn't feel like I had the opportunity to. I felt like my employer, I felt like I was going to get fired if I came forward. This was a project that was known all around the community, was known provincially. And I felt like if I came forward and said that there was something wrong, that could look bad publicly for the company, and that they would separate themselves from me. Within my family, I was there were some things going on in our family with some turmoil, and I felt like I had to be there for everybody else. And so I didn't think it was an appropriate time for me to say that I was struggling and that I was almost falling down to one knee. And of course, the third hit was, that eventually this got worse and worse and worse and worse. And when the project got the no, we went through a 6-month process of going from 55 staff down to 8. And when I finally asked to be let go, it was like experiencing a death. It was watching all these people that had all worked so well together, all one by one sort of lose their jobs. And I just was sitting there watching the whole thing crumble. I guess I took on that role of crumbling with it. And when I left the company, I got a severance package that was, really good for the time that I put in. But that gave me this opportunity to not have to worry about anything financially. Everything was covered for like a year, and it certainly wasn't, because I didn't choose to go down the right road. I chose to go down the road of excess, and so that we went through about 6 months of that. And at that point, my wife finally said she couldn't deal with whatever it was that was going on. I cloaked it as depression, and I believe that there was a lot of depression involved, but I still hadn't admitted at that point that there was addiction involved. And so then I went on a 18-month bender after I broke up with my wife, and honestly, towards the last 3 months, all I did was get up, feel the pain of coming off of the drugs and the alcohol that I'd been consuming, followed by finding the drugs and alcohol again and getting back to a place of numbness. And I went through that cycle for months. And I was basically, really, at the end of the day, I was killing myself without actually killing myself. Like, when I look back on it now, it's hard to look at, because I do realize that I unconsciously was trying to end my life. I certainly wasn't, I've never had that thought. I've never thought that way. It's just upon reflection and looking back, there was no other road that I was going down. There's just no other explanation for what I was doing to myself. And so all of a sudden, one night, I was sitting, at this point, I'm living in a motel. I've almost lost everything. And it's about 3:30 in the morning, and I'm drunk, and I'm hiring a kite. And all of a sudden, I take this deep breath, and I can only explain that I somewhat came out of my body. I woke up. I was completely conscious. I went through about a 4 to 4.5 minutes of going in reverse over the past 18 months of my life and going, oh my God, I did it again. There have been 2 other times in my life where I've hit rock bottoms, where I've lost everything. But this time I really had no concept of what I was doing. And I all of a sudden I was aware, and I'm looking around the room like it was the first time I'd been in the room, and looking down at the alcohol and the drugs that were around me. And I had a moment, and I told myself I would give myself 24 hours to have my last hurrah. And I had my last hurrah of that 24 hours. And at 1 o'clock the following day, I stopped doing drugs and I stopped drinking alcohol. I went through a terrible 4 days of detoxing myself, and I didn't go to any medical clinic. I didn't talk to anybody about doing it. I just self-imposed it on myself. I learned later that was probably a really dangerous thing to do. But like most things in my life, I still have that go hard or go home thing in me. And I don't know if that's the gender part, or if that's just how I was raised, or part of my DNA, or all of those things. It probably is everything put together in a perfect storm. And during those 4 days, something happened. All of a sudden, friends and family found me. And again, I didn't tell very many people where I was. And I had people from the Ajax Project come and knock on the door. I had people that, and owners of other companies that I worked for in the past. They just started showing up. It was an incredible experience, and one that I didn't really understand in the beginning. I had a very, very good friend of mine, a couple, Jason and Cheryl Page. They reached out to me, and over the course of 24 hours of interaction back and forth between us, once they come to my door, they offered to put me through a treatment program should I decide to better my life. And I sat with that for 5 days, and I said, well, I have to stay sober for 9 days. And if I stay sober for 9 days on my own, then I know I'm ready to walk down that path. I just didn't want to waste anybody's money. And so I decided after that 9 days of sobriety that I would go to a treatment facility. And so I went to the treatment facility for 40 days. I went to Chopra Wellness in Squamish. And about 7 days into that experience, I started to realize that as I cleaned up more and more and more, and by the time I was a week into Chopra, I was sober for about 3 weeks. So there's for anybody that hasn't gone through that process, there's like 3 days where the chemicals start to get out of your body. Then there's sort of after 21 days, there's the fog starts to lift, they call it, and so, you know, the first 21 days there's a lot of sleeping, there's a lot of forgetting, there's a lot of, like, you can't even come up with words properly. There's a lot of things that start to go when you start to reboot your body back into a healthy lifestyle. And so at 21 days, when some of these things started to happen, I started to realize that when I was speaking in the groups, that I was having an effect on others. And the more that I started to share about my experience from an authentic, truthful place, the more that I was providing this space for other people to open up and share themselves. And of course, we're all in a healing environment, but even the staff started pulling me to the side and they're like, have you always spoken like this? And I would laugh because I'm like, well, I've always spoken. And if I was really passionate about a project, yes, I guess I would have some passion, but not like this. There's something different about this. And that was the point when I started to understand that there was a difference between what I was perceiving would have happened when I cleaned myself up or when I asked for help and what actually happened. And there were two things that happened for me. There's the interaction, one-on-one stories, like my story of meeting Kayla for the first time, where she calls me from the doctor's office after I have an appointment with Dr. Ayub, and all of a sudden she asks me how I'm doing, and I don't even know why she's calling me, because I happen to have a medical clinic that is amazing and they've got social workers that follow up with you. And so I have a moment with her where I start talking about, she asked me how I'm doing, and I said, well, how long do you have? And she goes, I have an hour. And after I got over the fact that I had an hour with this person I never talked to before, I said, well, get ready and buckle up because I'm going to tell you the truth. And we had this hour-long conversation. And of course, if we had never had that conversation, or if I had never taken the opportunity to tell her my truth, I wouldn't be sitting here before you guys right now talking, because she offered to have me speak publicly about it because I was so openly sharing, right? And so there was that lineage of things, but there was also this cosmic lineage of things that were happening because I've slowed myself down and I decided to be truthful with myself, and I decided that I was going to put that energy out into the universe, that I was not going to hide behind anything or lie about anything anymore. All of these things started to place themselves in front of me, and it becomes not having to go through life and have a plan. You can think about maybe what your next 5 years wants to look like, but if you ever think that you're going to understand the path it's going to take to get there, you're mental. Like, there's just no way. That's not possible. And so it's like having markers, but then it's having the ability to slow yourself down enough to see the stuff as it comes by, because the universe will provide it for you. And it's not that I'm a necessarily religious individual. I'm a spiritual person, but I really now am starting to believe in the molecules that are around us, the DNA in our structure, that there's something larger than ourselves, that if we slow ourselves down enough, and if we get to what I perceive as the true brain of ourselves, which is actually what's going on in our chest, not in our head. I think our brain is actually a muscle that's used like the heart is used, or like our spleen is used, or our liver. There's something that we understand, and I guess I should probably do that. Something that goes on in here that tells us what's right and what's wrong, and that tells us when something important is coming across our plate. that's the real part of us that can allow us to go through the universe in such a different way. That wasn't exactly the conversation I thought that I was going to have with everybody, but they're always different because I don't go by a script. I think that I'll leave it there, and I think I'll open it up to the three of us to have a conversation.
Well, I was going to just note to you, Ryan, as well. I like that you shared that it's the brain, the mind, and the heart, and I think maybe that's where that perceived stigma and the self stigma comes in, is in here. But maybe we need to listen more here.
Absolutely, 100%. It's in here. And what is in, yeah. What's so interesting about it is that I mean, there's always going to be stigma. I think there's always going to be people that are going to catch up, but I believe that as a conscious on our on our planet right now, I mean, when you look at all of the things that are happening to us, when you look at, it's not just British Columbia that's, you know, for us, it's COVID, and then it's the 215 children being found in Kamloops, and now they're being found all over the country, and then it's the fires, and it just keeps moving on. It's like it's putting us through this on purpose, because we have this opportunity now emotionally to mature. And so what becomes important in our life when we see this chaos happening all around us, you start to have to get real with what's important and what's not important.
Yeah,
and I think for a reason.
Exactly. And I think actually it comes kind of back to that definition of trauma. It's not the event itself, it's how we respond to the event. And what it's kind of about learning, I think, is again, listening here and saying, like, what am I supposed to take from this experience? Right? Not what's going on in here and how overwhelming it is. Anybody with depression, anxiety knows what goes on in your head is insane, right? And hard to overcome. But if you are able to take that moment, like you said, Ryan, and just stop and just like look at what's going on around you and just be like, wow, like, what can I do with this experience? And I agree, like that's exactly what I've done. And Kayla, again, thank you very much, because you helped me a lot when I had to stop working. And again, like Ryan said, he was always that rock for those people. And for me, my whole life, as long as I look back, I always was that person that people went to for advice. I always took care of everybody but myself. And so when that had to stop, I had so much guilt because I felt like I'm letting everybody down. And I really had a hard time realizing that, you know, I was this glass of water, and I was taking, you know, my glass and filling everybody else's with it, and my glass emptied. And without that there, I was no longer able to help them the way that I normally would. I had nothing left to give. And so it came down to me looking at the experience and saying, like, well, what's the purpose of this? And Kayla really helped me find that purpose by allowing me to come in and help facilitate these groups, because I was able to use my voice in a way that I wasn't using it before. Instead of numbing myself, and for myself, Ryan, you know, you turned to substance, I just numbed. I just stopped feeling. Like I didn't feel love, I didn't feel happy, I didn't feel sad, I just didn't feel. And it allowed me to recognize, wow, like the more I'm using my voice, I started being able to feel pride, and I started to feel like I'm doing something for like good, but I'm using the experience that I'm going through to do that. And so that's the one thing I've learned, is taking my experiences and using my voice, and how that has changed things and how people have responded to it. And I think that kind of leads us to, you know, where we wanted to go with this, and saying, like, since I've been sharing my journey, I mean, I've shared now, anybody who knows me knows I'm very public about my journey at this point. Like, I'm on Facebook and I'm like, you know what, this is what I learned about my mental health today. And like, you know, I'm so proud of myself for doing this, and those kinds of things, and sharing and talking about, you know, the struggles I had with the system. And the more that I've talked, the more people who have come forward and said, thank you. Thank you for sharing your journey. Thank you for making videos about coping strategies and what you're going through and what's working for you. And it's encouraging other people to use their voices too. Out of hundreds
What I hear you saying, Haley, is that you're honoring yourself for one, and two, you're finding your purpose and meaning again.
100%.
When was the last
Yeah,
time we honored ourselves? Right, Ryan?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting concept, and what I love about the interaction that the three of us have is that you know, Kayla and Haley, you guys have this education-based understanding of how the brain works, how our bodies are working, how we interact with our environments, and all of those things. I don't. That's not how I've experienced this. I've experienced this through going through my personal pain and just noticing things as I'm going through them. Like I think we talked, one of the sessions that the three of us had, I was talking about, well, is this stigma real, or is this just something that I'm perceiving? Because the way the world's reacting around me as I'm telling my truth is not what I thought was going to happen. And actually, I'm getting the exact opposite of stigma. I'm getting this understanding, and people are thanking me, and like it's just this totally different reaction. And then, of course, the two of you are like, oh yeah, well, that's the thing. That's actually something that happens within yourself, is that you've created the boundary on your own, and you've created that inability. How you have to walk through that, but it's actually all created by yourself. Not, it isn't the outside world that created that barrier that you think is there.
Yeah. And I think to an extent, we know that in the past, mental health hasn't been accepted. You look back, you hear a lot of people from, older generations saying there was no depression, there was no anxiety, there was no autism when I was a kid. It's not that there wasn't. There was a lack of education and understanding, right? And so you used to have, I actually brought this topic up on Facebook, and somebody said, I remember being a kid, and those classes were just the retards. That was just it. They just were troublemakers and whatever. But there was something more to that was just misunderstood. And we're really fortunate to be where we are now, because now there's science backing all of this and saying, you know what, there really is, like, these are brain structural issues, these are chemical issues, these are, and we're getting so much more of an understanding that the conversation about mental health is becoming more public and more relevant. And so I think we're really fortunate. But we're still internalizing those old public stigmas, because that really wasn't that long ago.
Well, and you were talking earlier, Haley, about just as an example, the men, right? And that, we had to be strong, and we had to be the protectors, and we had to be all these things. And it really wasn't okay for us to be emotional, for us to show weakness and vulnerability. That wasn't our role. But really, if you go back, it's only 200 years. 200 years ago, that was necessary. That was necessary, or else your clan didn't survive. Like, there were strengths that those men had to have in order for the greater good of the community to be viable, right? And we think about the fact that's only a couple hundred years ago that we were really in that sort of primal survival mode of the three things that we needed were, we had to spend most of our day to attain that goal. Well, we don't live in that reality anymore, yet our bodies are still functioning in that way. And go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, it kind of comes back to, I know in the past we've talked about generational trauma and how it's actually passed through DNA. And so it's called epigenetics, right, is what it's actually called. But that can go up to 10 generations. So, we're still living with how the world has evolved, but our DNA and our brains have not. They haven't evolved to what we're actually living now. And so that really does play a part into our perception of public stigma.
I think there's beauty in the flaws. And I think the beauty of it is, I look at you, Haley and Ryan, as, you're well put together, you're intelligent, you're well spoken, you look like you have it all together. But the beauty behind that is that we don't. Your doctor, your psychologist, your neighbor, your dentist, your friend, your mom. There are moments, there are long periods of time, there are short periods of time, whatever that looks like, we all face something. And I think to acknowledge and validate that, when you talked about trauma earlier, Haley, I wanted to validate and acknowledge there's the small T trauma, and then there's the big T trauma. And Dr. Gabor Mate talks about that as it could be a divorce, could be a separation, could be your favorite animal dying, or could be the fires in Juniper or the residential school trauma that we're facing and all the bits and bobs that are in between. And it's acknowledging that a car accident can be the trauma that you hold within you, that you then feel that stigma and shame for feeling so stuck, right? Goes across the board.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it comes down to, we blame ourselves a lot for the way that we're feeling, right? And we think we're wrong for feeling that way, but we're not. That's actually, like I said, it's the experience, it's the reaction that your brain and those chemicals and all of those things are having to that event. You are not really in control of those things until you learn how to change your thought processes and that kind of stuff. So that's why things like cognitive behavioral therapy are just so important for everybody, not even people that are just, dealing with mental health illness. It's important for everybody to know, how do we change our thoughts? How do we think something, but then realize what's real and what's not? And it's huge. It's the way that, we changed our way of thinking, Ryan. Right? It's now I'm not looking at this journey as a hindrance anymore. I'm not looking at it as, why is this happening to me and this kind of thing. And now I'm looking at it and I'm like, wow, look how much I've learned about myself. Look at how many people I've been able to help by sharing my story. And now I know that, for instance, a residential program, it was really stressful. It was a really, really difficult job. And I loved it at the same time that it was terrifying. But now I'm realizing that by sharing my story and talking to people and listening to others and, sharing those experiences, that I'm really helping in a different way. And that's leading me in a different direction. That's saying, go get your counseling diploma, because it's working. So it's, it really does. If you let your heart, you listen to this instead of your brain, like Ryan said, what is good for you and what can you do with that for the world?
Well, and I think it's interesting too, like Haley, you and me have both touched on being the rock. And I often think back now, because I consider the life I'm leading now sort of Ryan 2.0. Like there's the old Ryan that I had to, I sort of had a ceremony and I had to sort of bury him, and I've sort of developed this sort of newer version of myself. And I think back to being the rock, and I wonder how much of that was me not wanting to actually deal with the flaws that I had within myself. And so if I was busy helping everybody else, I didn't have to look at what was going on within me. And that led me, I had to smash that rock until I would finally do something to help myself, right? In critical ways. And I wonder, because, funny enough, like all the time I've spent this last 8 months getting myself back in order and fixing myself and bringing myself back up from the ashes, the world kept going just fine. My family's still there. They didn't die. Like, all those things that I thought were going to break down really didn't. And, I wonder about that. And I guess it kind of leads me to, where do we go from here? And what are, people that are watching this, what questions might they have for us at this point after watching this first episode?
Yeah, I agree. Like the world still goes on, and it's totally, I was my husband's educator. He had a really lack of understanding about mental illness and stuff like that. And so a lot of his perceptions of the world, perceptions of things he didn't understand, were so different. But the more that I was able to educate him, you know, the more he was understanding. And so then when I had to drop that, I was like, oh my God, like, is he going to be okay? Like, am I, you know, he works away from home and I know it's really stressful for him. Am I going to be able to continue supporting him? And it's just amazing how, you know, he really started becoming my rock. And he was just like, you know what, like, it sucks. Like, I have to work double time to make sure that we're surviving. And he's like, but like, you're worth it. And you take time for you. And he was so encouraging about it. And he's okay. You know, it's been stressful. Of course, he's got his own things going on, his own stressors, but he's okay. And I'm learning that it's not selfish to take care of myself.
Yeah. And I think that's key, Haley. And I think those are the big questions we want to be asking. And, you know, not only how do we support ourselves, how do we honor ourselves, how do we know what our boundaries are? That's really difficult, and how much we can give. But not only as an individual, but for those that we love. So whether it's, you're talking about your partner and having to support him and understanding, but he too needs to support you and understanding. And it's that combination of finding that middle ground and making sure that everyone feels safe and secure and heard. Because with mental health and trauma and just that stigma, everybody can be touched by that in a family unit, whatever that family looks like. And so acknowledging that communication and that connection is so key. I didn't mean to cut you off, Haley, but the question I have, I guess, for the takeaways is, what can we do as an individual facing these struggles, or those caring for someone facing those struggles? That's the $1 million question. And we're kind of going to dive in and kind of chat about what are those things that we find have worked. What are the safety plans? What are the resources and things we can pull in that will help us break down those barriers within ourselves, but also help educate and inform other people, and spreading the love and the word about mental health and stigma, and how it's okay to not be okay. I'm going to say that.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that.
It's true, right? And like, one of the things that this is, the more I've talked about it, of course, like I said, the more people are coming forward to me, and obviously having that education in the background is really helpful too. But what the experience has taught me, and if I could just sum it up, is that people are afraid to be vulnerable, right? They don't want to look vulnerable, but there's a strength in vulnerability. And the way that I look at it now is, by allowing yourself to be vulnerable, look how much courage that takes. It takes courage to be vulnerable. So if you are courageous enough to allow yourself to express your vulnerabilities, then you're a lot stronger than you are to hide it.
So there's that education piece where people find that being tough and we've got it all figured out is actually the way to be, when in reality, the way to live a healthy and balanced life in all facets is to just express where we're at, and being okay with that, and that real talk. And that vulnerability of, I'm not okay today, I need to take a day off, or I don't have space for you right now, or you coming home and sharing about your day, I don't have space for that today. Those are things that we can continue to build that sustainability within ourselves, so that we can continue, right?
Yeah, you have to be able to set healthy boundaries, right? And that is very difficult to do, especially when you're like, you know, Ryan and myself and Kayla, you too, I'm sure we're all very empathetic people. We pull everybody else's things into ourselves. But yeah, like, it's definitely true. We have to set those boundaries and say, you know what, like, let me check in with me first. Because again, like I said, if my cup is empty, I have nothing to give you. Right? And they talk about window of tolerance. So if my cup is empty, you know, a normal window of tolerance might be like this. So this is all the things in your life that you can tolerate in a day without getting into, you're becoming really sad, becoming really angry, whatever. So your window of tolerance is like this normally. But on a day where I'm like, you know what, like, I'm feeling vulnerable already, my window of tolerance is like this. It's not going to take very much for me to go either up here and get really angry, or go down here and get really depressed. So it's trying to keep yourself in that balance.
And I think it's important for people to realize too, anybody that's watching this video that's living in the interior right now is that, you know, you're probably like this right now. Like your cup probably isn't available because, you know, what's going on around us right now is absolute chaos, and it has an effect. And so if you feel like you've got a short fuse and you can't figure out why, I mean, these are those moments to sit down and slow yourself down and take some deep breaths. It's okay. It's okay. Most of us are feeling this. You're not alone in this. And you know, for the people that can resonate with Haley and I when they're talking about being a rock, just because you feel like that, it doesn't, like, we're not trying to say that you're less of, or that there's anything wrong with the path that you've taken up until this moment. We're just asking you to take a breath and start to hopefully realize that you don't need to be everything for everybody else, and to maybe have a look and see if maybe there's something missing within yourself that you could work on before you have to hit a bottom, before you have to smash that rock into the ground. You know, I would much rather someone, or before you end up, you know, just ending up in a alcohol and drug infused state. Like, you know, there's markers when you can ask for help. And you know, I honestly believe that, you know, most of the perception of negativity that you think you'll get from people is within yourself. You know, that stigma is mostly within you. And there are people with open arms waiting for you to say that you need help. And if you think that everybody around you doesn't know, you're sadly mistaken. They just don't know how to approach you.
Yeah, they may not understand how to talk to you about it, which is part of the thing. So it's not just about educating yourself on these things, but if you don't share it with people, like, so part of my journey that I realized, you know, when I started expressing, you know, I'm dealing with depression and anxiety and whatever, like, I had friends not contact me, but when I talked to them, they said, I just don't understand it. And I don't know what you need from me. So if I'm not telling people this is what I need, then that's a barrier to my relationships. So that's all the more reason to keep talking, because the more that I talk to those people and say, okay, well, you know, I just really need you to just be my friend the normal way you would be.
But how do we know what we need? And I think it ties into both what you and Ryan just said, is be curious and ask why. Like, it's not about that guy in traffic that cut you off. It could be, because that also frustrates me, but why did I get so angry? It's not about that I lost my pen and I'm so upset I lost my pen. It's not about the damn pen. So asking yourself why, and be curious about the way that you're feeling in your tummy, the sensation in your hands, doing the body scan, and really just asking the big question as to why. We don't always have that answer, Haley. I know I've asked you that before, is to reflect on where that trigger might have come from. And it's like, well, I don't know, but just continue being curious about your body and why.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like Ryan said earlier, you know, it's not always, it doesn't come down to one thing. Like I said, in the interior, we got the residential schools, we got the fires, you know, we got this and that and the other thing, but you also have things going on in your own life. So, you know, like for me, I'm trying to sell my house, and then there was the fire and that put a damper in it. And then there was the hot temperatures. And then there was, you know, people in my family getting diagnosed with illnesses, and, you know, those kinds of things. There's been so many things. So you have to consider, like you said, your window of tolerance is like right here already. So yeah, my dog unplugged my phone charger one day when I was in the middle of a panic attack, and it made I just lost it, you know, over an unplugged charger. Like, it wasn't, it's just, you really have to kind of know where you're at and check in with yourself and be like, how do I feel? What are the things that might be contributing to this? And you may not always know a trigger. Sometimes you can just wake up in the morning and it's a bad day, right? And I think you have to learn too, at the same time, that sometimes we won't know. And that has to be okay. You have to learn to live with that.
Well, what does my diagnosis mean to me? And you mentioned, Haley and Ryan, we've learned so much about ourselves and how this is a part of us. But somebody with depression over here may not be the same person with depression over here, or someone who uses substances isn't the same person. So that's where that stigma and that criteria, we don't fit in these boxes, guys. There ain't no such thing. So anytime that makes you check a box, question, why, and advocate for yourself because we don't fit into boxes. And so ask, finding out what that diagnosis is a part of you, what it means for you. This is what it looks like. This is what it comes out as. This is why I say these things, and just learning about what it means for you and you only.
Yeah. And I mean, like, it's funny because you look back when you go through this kind of stuff, you start reflecting back on your life and trying to figure out what kind of experiences have led me here. What was my environment like? What were learned behaviors? Who were my peers? What was going on at my school? Like so many different things, right? And it's funny because for myself, I was like, yeah, no, I just like developed anxiety because of this. And now I look back and I can see all of these little things in my history where I'm like, oh, you had anxiety your whole life. It just never hindered you. It never put you to a halt. And it was like that flick of a switch, just like Ryan with your flick of the switch to reality. It was a one thing just flipped on my light switch and that threw me over the edge. Right. And yeah, we really have to see that there's that suitcase of life. It really does lead us to where we are. And I don't even know how to say it, but going back and finding out those things about yourself is actually really rewarding. And I have learned to become so thankful for this journey I'm on. And that sounds so counteractive to so many people, just be like, I'm thankful that I'm depressed, like how does that make sense to most people? But it's true. I am. And I see different areas of my life. Like I've used my voice now to not only talk about, my anxiety and stuff, but I've learned how powerful my voice is. And so recently with the fires in Juniper, I stood up and I said, this is ridiculous. Like not having this exit. I wrote this letter that ended up going to the federal government within 5 days. Because I learned how to use my voice. Like how amazing is that kind of stuff? And like, I am so thankful for that. And it's funny, I saw on, I can't remember if it was it was one of the radio stations posted a question on Facebook. If you could tell yourself 3 words, if you could go back 10 years or whatever, tell yourself 3 words. And I said, use your voice.
And we talk about Cosmos. Yeah, there's another one of those. Yeah. Fate.
Yeah.
Let's talk about supports. We talk about sharing with people. Now, I share a lot with folks I support is, okay, some of us are lucky enough to have natural supports within our family, whatever family looks like, unit. Some people don't. So let's have a conversation around supports, even for your guys' perception of who do we turn to? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I think for mental health, like you said, right, understanding your diagnosis, but not only that, how do you get a diagnosis? Right? Where do you start? Where do you even start with that? And for me, it started with, I literally lost my mind after a fight with my husband. And I said, I need a counselor. And I started talking to that counselor. And then I realized, let's try the naturopathic stuff, and it didn't work for me. And so then it was like, okay, I need to talk to my doctor. And so really it all started with talking to a physician. Because they were able to, even though they don't necessarily, like I said, I learned it was a lack of education on the point of MDs with mental health. That's not a part of their normal training, though it should be now with how much recognition there is. But that's where it started, because I was able to get on the medication to help stabilize me a little bit. And I was able to advocate for myself more, but they were able to connect me with things like you, Kayla, social workers, and people who could help to connect me to those resources.
And Ryan, for you, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, did your sharing and connection start with your personal and natural supports? Tell me a bit about that for you.
Sorry, in what way?
Well, we talk about sharing our story with folks and expressing how we're feeling and connecting with people. And some folks don't have those natural supports. And I'm wondering for you specifically, Ryan, do you find that your kind of journey began with sharing about your story with your friends and your colleagues and your neighbors? I find that there was a bit of stuff that you shared earlier about friends coming to you and things like that. Talk about those supports.
Mine was, I honestly believe that there was some sort of divinity involved in my ability to sober up. And the moment that happened, within 48 hours, people just started coming out of the woodwork as sort of perfectly timed supports. And I know that that's not always how those things happen. I had an extreme case, but I do believe that there is something within our energy that when we flip a switch, the universe provides opportunities for people to come and assist us. So yeah, for me, it started with friends coming to my door, but also from the moment that I had my moment, I just started telling the truth. You know, and one of the first people that came was my boss at Ajax, Yves Lacasse. And you know, he just said, look, man, I heard that things weren't going very good for you. And I had to come and find you. And I've taken the day off to do that. And we went for lunch and I just told him the truth. I just told him everything that was happening. And the fact that I just sobered up like 3 days before that, you can only imagine what I looked like 3 days into sobriety, talking to my ex-boss, who also used to be the ex-chief of police in Kamloops. It was terrifying. But again, from that moment on, I was like, well, I'm not going to BS anymore. So this is what's going to happen. You know, from that, like, you know, at the end of that first conversation with that first person where I got real, he's like, at the end, he's like, I can't believe you told me the truth. He goes, you know, I've talked to a lot of people when they're in the spot that you're in. I can't believe you just flat out told me what was going on. And yeah, I mean, it's just, the reaction's been just, it's been earth shattering for all of the beliefs that I had about the negativity that I would receive by admitting this vulnerability and this weakness. And it's been far the opposite.
I love that you said that. It actually made me emotional. I don't know if you can tell on camera, I started tearing up, but that is it. Sharing your truth. That is where you start.
But I want to add though, like for those loved ones, asking about how are you doing, maybe not even how are you doing, because that's a loaded question. So if I wanted to check in with Haley, if I was a concerned friend, and I would say to you, are you facing mental health issues? Are you depressed? Asking that question, are you suicidal? Are you depressed? Yes. Are you using substances? It's not going to make people use more. It's not going to make people more depressed. In fact, being honest and calling out what you see sometimes, correct me if I'm wrong, can provide that validation. So don't be afraid or shy to make things worse or whatever that might look like. Do you guys have thoughts about that and people coming to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So as a part of my job, I have to be aware of, you know, looking for signs and symptoms of suicide ideation, right? I work with a very vulnerable community of youth who have faced a lot of trauma in their lives. And so we had to take a specific course, and it's called Safe Talk. And it is available to the community as well. And I highly recommend this course. It was really, really wonderful. But it literally teaches you to not beat around the bush. And I think that's what society has taught us, is to kind of beat around the bush. Like, how are you feeling? Like, no, you need to be direct. Yeah, right? You need to be direct. And so it's not, you know, it's not just like saying like, you seem like you're not doing well today. Then you got to open the conversation with open-ended questions, not closed questions, right? And so it comes down to with suicide training, it's not okay to beat around the bush. It's literally, hey, are you thinking of taking your life? Or are you thinking of suicide? Like, it needs to be direct, because otherwise people aren't going to answer it, because that's again, that shame, that stigma, that personal, there's something wrong with me. I don't want to burden other people. And I get that. That's a very normal part of mental health. I went a very long time without saying anything to anybody because I didn't want to burden anybody. And I knew better. I'm trained in mental health, but it didn't matter because that's how I felt. That was what was internalized. And so it's be direct. Are you thinking of suicide? And don't say committing suicide is another thing I learned, because when you're committing something, you're committing a crime.
A negative connotation.
Exactly. So are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking of taking your life? Those are the direct questions. And it's very, very important.
And being kind and compassionate to yourself too is I have the wrong words all the time. And I think being authentic, being real, talking about the truth and telling them, I really care about you. Some things you're sharing with me and showing me, it makes me feel like you might be feeling or having thoughts of suicide, or that you may be facing mental health concerns. So approaching folks and just sharing that you care about that individual, it might go right over their head because at that moment they don't hear those things. I could, but just providing a safe place and that you're ready to hear what they have to say.
Yeah. And what's the worst that can happen? If Ryan or you said to me today and I was in a really bad place, like, hey, like, just what you said, I feel like something's not right with you today. Are you by chance thinking of suicide? And what's the worst I'm going to say? If I'm not, I'm going to probably laugh and be like, no, I promise, like, that's not what's happening. I'm not going to get offended for you caring for me.
People can.
Well, I think
I
think there's something important in this. And of course, we're using a pretty extreme case of a check-in here with suicide. So like there's so many other conversations that you can have with people that are real, and hopefully it doesn't start there. Hopefully that's an
starting point
from other conversations you've had with the person. But one of the things that I don't know the science behind it. I don't know the stats behind it. I just know my own story. And there were months there in that 18 months when I was caught in my addiction and I was living somewhat unconsciously, that people did come in and ask certain questions, and the odd time there'd be a fairly direct question, and I would flat out get angry. And sometimes I'd kick people out of my place, or sometimes I would leave a situation. I would absolutely, you are not always going to get the response you want.
This is true. Yeah. And I mean, I guess it depends too. If you're, at that point, you might be in denial of something and not wanting to admit it or whatever, right? Or
there's shame, there's guilt, there's denial, there's all of those things that are boiling points within a person when they're stuck in a situation, right? But here's the thing. Sometimes you need to go down further before you're going to rise back up. And so the person that's truthful with you and the person that's real with you is the person at the end of the day, once you start to get your life back in order, that's going to realize that they had a real friend that was there during it. They're not going to be there 8 months later and go, man, I was wondering what was wrong with you, but they never said a word to you. You're not going to have as much respect for that person as you are for the person that sat down. Now, not publicly, not around a table of your family, not in a situation that's going to embarrass you, one-on-one and real. Like that is the piece that long-term will be respected, and may also not happen that day, but maybe it can be a contributing factor for you to finally put your hand out and reach for help.
Correct. Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, one of the things that we talked about when we were kind of planning this was removing isolation. So what is the thing that most people with mental illness do is they isolate themselves because, again, they don't want to be a burden. So if you have family and friends reaching out to you, recognize that it is important to have them in your life, right? And I had a conversation with a loved one the other day who expressed that they were struggling. And I said straight up to them, I had so many people say, well, during my journey, it doesn't matter what time of day, if you need to reach out to me, go ahead and reach out to me. And yes, that was really nice, but did I utilize it? No, because there was still that internal, I'm a burden. But now, who are the people that I reach out to? Who are the people that I message and say, hey, you know what? I'm feeling really lonely. Can we go do something? Those are the people.
Being a consistent friend, person, and saying and checking in, but always not swaying on your commitment to your person or people that you care about. So that when Ryan was ready to finally, or at that moment when he was ready to take on the next stage of the 2.0 Ryan, he knew he had people back here. He knew that. And at that moment, maybe that was the safety net to know people got my back. But months before, I don't need them. That's not a situation I need to go down that route. Thank you for your concern. But he had that crack maybe in his thinking of when he was ready, that he knew that he had people behind him. So being consistent and not swaying on your support and recognizing it maybe not personal. It's the person struggling internally. And checking in with yourself too as a loved one, caring for other people and making sure that you too need support. You too need to learn about what this means for you, and acknowledging that you are impacted as well. And it's that cycle of we can't keep giving if we don't have anything left. So knowing that everyone surrounding us deserves a bit of that space and attention as well, and taking care of ourselves. I think, any more takeaways, you guys, for how do we break down those barriers?
So I just want to touch base on this because I just thought of it. Like Ryan said, like the truth and asking for help, right? Don't be afraid to ask, because honestly, so for instance, I had this conversation with a loved one the other day, and it was the first time they had actually opened up about how they were feeling, and they posted on Facebook, and they said, you know what, I don't normally bring this stuff to Facebook, but I don't know what to do. I don't know who to talk to. And the one thing they said to me was they could not believe the amount of people who commented. One of their friends called them right away and just said, what's going on? You know, and just allow yourself to have those experiences and recognize sometimes people might not, again, be comfortable because they don't understand what's going on. So just because somebody doesn't reach out does not mean they don't care. Recognizing that people can't read your mind, because how guilty are we of that? Like, how can you not see that I'm struggling? Why haven't you asked me if I'm okay? You know, those kinds of don't get yourself into that thought. Like I think that's a really important thing, is don't think that people don't care just because they're not reaching out. Sometimes it really does take you.
Building your team of warriors, right? Knowing who those safe people are, and making a bit of a role. And maybe mom isn't the person I talk to. Maybe my neighbor, you know, my friend that I grew up with next door is the person I would talk to. Or maybe it's not my husband that I talk to. Maybe it's my sister. And recognizing where and who would that safe person be to start that conversation, vice versa.
And actually, I loved, that was one of the things that you and I had talked about when I was really struggling. You said, make a list of your support system and what they're good for. Because everybody in your support system is good for something different, right? There's the person that I'm going to go to when I'm crying and I just need someone to listen. Someone who's not going to be offering me advice, saying you should do this, you should do that, just someone that's going to listen, right? Like those kinds of things. Recognize who those people are and making note of it. It really does make a difference.
Ryan, what are your thoughts with any last takeaways here before we close up this heavy conversation?
I think we've touched on everything that I would have hoped that we would have. I think the interesting part now will be to see, you know, for the people that take the time to watch this, would be, you know, like this is just the start of potentially continued conversations that we can have. It would be interesting to know where people would like this conversation to go from here.
Well said, Ryan.
Yeah. And I like when we were talking, I made a little list of stuff that we were kind of like thinking. I'm just going to quickly read off the list. And obviously, if people want to know more about specific things and how do I attain that and those kinds of things, those are questions. Please open it up to us. We're 100% willing to answer your questions, whether it be we do another video and answer the questions after the fact. But ideally, I think where we want to go with this is that we would like to actually have like conversations with people, right? But some of the things that we put, of course, and some of them we touched on already, understanding your diagnosis and how to get it, a lack of ongoing education about your diagnosis. So that might be one of the barriers that you find. So how can, like, what kinds of things can you do to learn about it if there's not resources around? Removing the isolation, finding your worth and purpose, which I think honestly has been probably the biggest part of my recovery thus far. May not be for everybody, but for me it is. Building your confidence again, connection with yourself and like-minded peers, So like this group, how much this has done for me, because we all understand each other in a certain way, right? We get something out of all of us, you know. The ability to sit with yourself, which I know, you know, I'm still struggling with that. I'm getting a lot better. And it's just trying to actually allow yourself to feel what you're feeling and actually allow yourself to realize who you are and how your life has changed and those kinds of things. And then therapy.
Connection, period. It could be therapy, it could be nature, it could be interpersonal connection, it could be finding your purpose, connecting to a social group, you know, connection. And that's why, Haley, to echo what you said, is we want to have real conversations with real people face to face. The Zoom's been great, guys. Really love it. Thank you for being a great system we've had in this pandemic, but we want people and connection. So that's why this group, it will be the feelers. It'll be the feelers of what do people want to know more about regarding these conversations. We want to hear from the folks in community and Orchards Walk, as well as to where we want to go from here and how we can expand these conversations and open up space for that connection in person. That's the end goal. So I think for now, I would love to post this video, not only on our Steps Health website, but conversations around sharing with other people in community and getting that information out about validating our traumas, our mental health concerns, and validating that we all face some sort of struggles and barriers, but that there should not be stigma. And we want to get the word out, right? These conversations need to continue to be had. So posting it on our website, that'll be coming up. So keep an eye. As well as I will share and provide a bit of resources to that video as well to take a peek at. What can I do to support a loved one? What are the crisis lines? What are the mental health supports in Kamloops? What are the substance use supports in Kamloops? Where do I start? That navigation tool. But I think long term, you know, I think we'll pick up with these groups again in the fall, but more specifically targeting towards in-person connection, because I think we're missing it.
Yeah, we miss being like, you know, able to physically touch people. Like, you know, we've talked about it in past groups, like how a 20-second hug actually can like completely change your day, like literally, physically, chemically, all of it. Like we definitely miss that connection. And one thing I just want to say before we end too is this is a starting point for the conversation about stigma. So how can you help to spread the word? Share the video. Share the video, or if it comes up in conversation, be like, I watched this great video. This is what I learned, or whatever, because we teach the public by talking to a few people at a time, and then those people spreading the word. It's very much like they teach you in like retail, right? If you have a good experience somewhere, you might tell like 3 people. If you have a bad experience, you might tell like 10. But that's how people find out about things, is through talking to their peers. So please share the information. You never know who might be struggling. You never know what this information could do for somebody.
Wonderful, folks. So I'll make sure that there's some resources also available. I understand this conversation. It was, we had a framework. I think we hit the framework and the goals, but I understand we talked about some other heavy things, and to just check out with you guys and the folks watching and recognizing where we're at the moment, and just processing the information. And so just being kind to yourself today, taking time to reflect on things we've heard and learned, maybe writing down some thoughts on paper, as I did as we were going through, to not only learn more about, but to decompress about, to acknowledge, and reminding ourselves that if we're not okay, that's okay, and taking that time for you and honoring yourself. And just, I think we're going to take one deep breath together. Can we do that? Okay, we'll go in for 4 and out for 4. Ready? Let's do that once more. That felt good.
And honestly, guys, to end that, breathe. Your breath is your best tool. There are tons of different breathing exercises that you can find on YouTube. You can trace your fingers, breathe in while you trace up and down while
Yeah.
you trace down. Do that for your hand. Just deep breaths is going to reset your nervous system. It's literally your body reset button. So if you are feeling overwhelmed, that is probably your best tool to use.
Yeah, check in with yourselves. Thank you both very much. It's not easy sharing your personal stories, but I think we've learned that courage is vulnerability is courage, and that changes things, that moves things. So thank you to you both again and again and again. Powerful for me, but powerful for those lives we touch. So breathe, take the day, and we will all reconnect, maybe in person sooner than later. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla.
Till next time.